Welcome to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where you can learn and be inspired by real-world examples of how technology is transforming businesses and reshaping industries in a language everyone can understand. Here is your host, Neil C. Hughes.
Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where every day we learn how technology is transforming an industry, business, life, or even world. But on that journey, 365 days a year, we also like to bust a few myths and perceptions along the way on this podcast. And today, I want to tackle the world of UX. The experience economy is in full swing now, but if you were to go out there and ask 10 people what's good UX and what is bad UX, I suspect you would get 10 different ideas. So I wanted to talk with someone that has vast experience in the industry and hear about their story, the changes they've seen, and the insights that they've gained throughout their career on UX. And also not only where it's been, but where it's heading and the kind of trends that they're seeing. So today's guest is a UX designer called Sam, who's been building robust, user-friendly software for over 15 years. And Sam also recently returned to his native town, Toronto, after 20 years in the US to found his own consultancy called Strathearn Design. Previous to this, he had senior product management positions at Teradata Marketing Applications and Qualcomm Inc. too. So he's got so much knowledge and insights to share. So enough from me. Let's get him on the show now. So a massive warm welcome to the show, Sam. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Yes, well, I'm a UX designer and I've been practicing for over 20 years. My pedigree is I have degrees in psychology and cognitive science, and that's how I entered the field in the early 2000s. And at the time, my title was human factors. The field of user experience actually originated in World War II when American fighters in planes were actually shooting each other down, friendly fire. And so they started a competency called human factors to try to understand how the tooling inside the planes could improve to not do the friendly fire. So the term user experience designer didn't really exist back then, but then slowly in the sort of late 2010s everything moved over to UX, and now we have this sort of confusing UX UI paradigm that people are in today. And so I have 20 years of experience actually working mostly with software. Some of my initial experience was in phone design as well, but I've worked on all sorts of different types of software.
Excellent. And one of the things I love doing on this daily tech podcast is, yes, we're going to talk about technology and the great work you're doing and the kind of problems you're solving with technology, but you also hear about the personal story that inspired you. So can you share your story and what inspired you to build this robust, user-friendly software for more than 15 years?
Yeah, sure. There was actually one book in particular that really inspired me a lot, and it's called The Design of Everyday Things. So, kind of my story a little bit is that I was in grad school, and I was in my second year out of potentially 5 or 6 or 7. And I was trying to decide what I really wanted to do with the rest of my life. I was going to continue finish my PhD, and so I started casting around looking for pragmatic ways to use my skill set. And that's when I encountered this book by, I didn't mention his name, is Don Norman. And it was just really fantastic. It completely opened a whole world to me. I mean, it talked a lot about how the world is not designed for people. It's kind of designed by the engineers to make things comfortable for the thing that you're being designed for. Now, in the case of computers, which he talks about a lot in this book, that everything is basically based on how the computer thinks, how the computer works, instead of how the person works. So my crusade, definitely over this past 20 years, the thing that keeps me burning is to continue to build software that is people-centric and human-centric and is not what Don Norman calls technocentric.
And I believe you then returned to your native town, Toronto, after 20 years in the US to actually found your own consultancy. Again, I feel there must be a story there too, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think a lot of it is just that, I was a Canadian citizen and I moved to the States to go to grad school. I wasn't necessarily intending on staying in the States my whole life. And then I had kids. And so there was this sort of like, are we going to raise our kids in the US or are we going to raise them in Canada? And at the same time, at that point, I had been working for sort of big bureaucratic monsters for probably 18 years. My first company, big company I stayed at for a long time was Qualcomm. And then the next major company was called Teradata. They're both Fortune 500 companies, but they're both very large, a lot of bureaucracy. It's difficult to get things done. And I became an expert on how to get things done, but it just all culminated in me deciding that, I think it's time for a change, time to move north, which is where I wanted to raise my children, and also to, step away for at least for a little while from these large companies and try to be more nimble and do my own thing.
And what did you set out to create with Strathearn Design then?
Sure. I think my initial take, and what I've definitely seen over and over again, is that my specialty was in B2B software. That's what I developed at Teradata. And Teradata had a number of marketing applications. We had 3 of them, and they were all very, very complex in various different ways. And Teradata had actually struggled several times to begin their UX consultancy, their UX practice. So they had hired various people, but they hadn't worked out for different reasons. And I began to see a trend over and over again that, there are a lot of companies that have problems with UX, in particular B2B companies that have long legacies, right? They have software that's 20 years old, 15 years old, or even 10 years old that's now really old and aging. And they know that it needs to be improved, but trying to figure out how to improve it has been a real struggle. So my purpose in founding the consultancy was to try to not necessarily do all of the work for the company, but to help guide them sort of at an executive level in terms of what should your hiring strategy be, what are the types of people that you should hire, because UX is very multifaceted and multidisciplinary. There's no such thing as just like UX. There's lots of subdivisions within it. So trying to figure out the right type of person, the right temperament for the company, that's kind of for me the sweet spot for Strathearn Design.
And you mentioned user experience there, and it seems to me that everyone is talking about it at the moment, and the experience economy that goes with it as well. And I do like to bust a few myths on this podcast and equally right a few wrongs along the way. So I wondered, as someone that's got vast experience in this space, could you set the record straight and describe what you think UX is and equally what UX isn't? Because I'm sure you've probably got a few annoyances that you've picked up.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Yeah, well, our industry as a whole is still relatively immature. It's very early, and so there isn't necessarily a common understanding of what UX is, even within our field. But I certainly have very strong opinions about it. One thing is that we actually call it the unicorn. There's no such thing as one person who can do all of the things inside what we would call user experience, or this title UI UX designer. Startups typically, because they don't want to hire more than one person, are looking for someone who has a real hybrid set of skills. And I'll just briefly go over what those skills are. So there's kind of 3 different archetypes, I'd say, within UX. One is someone who can do what we call usability studies, which is to basically test the product. You put something, it can be an early prototype or a late prototype or even a finished product, and you can put that in front of real users and give them a protocol, which is basically some kind of experiment, and see how well they do. Those people also often spend time side by side with users, either on WebExes or actually at their desk, trying to understand what the user is doing and try to come up with insights for what are some of the problems with the software. So that's one really big piece. And there are a lot of people who spend their entire career just doing that, just that piece. And those people are typically called UX researchers. Then you have this middle piece, which is dear to my heart because it's really what I started out as, and it's something I would call an interaction designer. Although nowadays, sometimes when you see the word UX designer, it does specifically refer to that. And that's someone who is really trying to deep dive into the software to understand how it works and come up with user flows and wireframes and basically try to understand the information design and information architecture of the product. And then finally, you have visual design. And visual design is probably what a lot of people think about when they're thinking about user experience. And visual design is very important. It taps into what, again, Don Norman called the visceral experience. So, if something doesn't look very good, then it just sort of doesn't make you feel good, doesn't call out to you. So the visual design is the aspect of choosing fonts, colors, weights, all sorts of things like that. But also it's really the emotional connection with the user. So those are all three very, very different competencies and actually require different backgrounds. And so, in terms of myth busting, there's really just no such thing as a person who's good at all three of those things. The best you could hope for is two. And when I've been, I've again have a lot of experience hiring, especially at Teradata. I hired a lot of people, Qualcomm as well. Almost always you find someone who's got a skill that's in one thing, and then has a secondary skill in the other, but they're always better at one thing than the other. Then the other myth that really bugs me, and this is really pervasive in the startup community, is the idea that the UX person, regardless of what their title is or role, should also be doing development. UX design is very hard. It's a lot of work. As I've already elaborated, there's a lot of different pieces to it. To do any of those pieces correctly is really difficult. So to then, in addition, expect that person to have the capability and competency to actually build the software itself, really, it's kind of a recipe for mediocrity. So I do see a lot of this. I see a lot of job postings looking for that, or someone called like a UI engineer who they want all the skills that they can possibly get. But I understand the motivation because, of course, if you can get one person to do everything, then that's really good on the budget. But just in the real world, it's very difficult to find people like that.
And another change that I'm seeing is younger users are entering the workplace now, especially around Gen Z, and they're bringing those same expectations they have as consumers into the workplace. And because of that, there's a lot of talk about the blurred lines between B2B and B2C. But I'm curious, is there a difference between B2B UX and B2C UX? Where do you stand on that?
Let me address a couple things there. I mean, one is that absolutely, when I talk to users in the B2B space, they're constantly referring to, can you make it like Facebook? Can you make it like Google? Can you make it like LinkedIn? So that's a theme that I hear everywhere. But at the same time, B2B software is productivity software. In other words, you're trying to get something done. And not only that, often there's a particular way that it has to be done, which might be specified by your organization. So an example of B2B might be like payroll. Well, you can't just like do whatever you want in payroll. There's certain processes that you need to follow. So I think in general, for B2B software, there's often a process of change management when the software comes in, when there's at least some type of training, not always, but at least some type of training or some type of help resource that might be able to help. But the other major difference is that when we talk about user experience, there's actually different ways you can optimize for something. Something can be efficient, which means you can do the same thing over and over again very quickly and very well, or it can be intuitive, which means it's really obvious. But often efficiency and intuitiveness are kind of opposed to each other, because something that's intuitive is sort of often going to be really glaring and obvious, but it might take up a lot of room on the real estate, on the screen, for example. So you might choose to optimize differently, optimize for efficiency for B2B software than for B2C. Again, those are all choices a designer needs to intentfully make. So there aren't always going to be these differences, but there's different choices that you're trying to make.
And I appreciate this is a pretty big question, but in your opinion, what does it take to successfully build good UX?
Wow, yeah, no, it definitely is a big question. I mean, that's kind of like, what is our field about? I would say that, you have to have rather than just really going into the details, I'd say that there's two things. Is one, you have to have a very good intuition for how users behave and understand things. And if you don't have that intuition, it's going to be very difficult for you to be a designer. And that's where I run into a lot of problems, not necessarily with designers, but especially when I'm working with engineers, as engineers have their own intuitions about how things work, but those intuitions are often based on how the computer thinks. So that's one, you really need that intuition. But then secondly, you need to be interested in understanding data and I'm not talking about big data, I'm talking about the data that I referred to earlier in terms of user research. So you need to be willing and open to hear what real users actually are saying and thinking and doing about the software that you're building, and be willing to change your mind about it. So I think, so one of the things I hear often in UX is to hold strong opinions, but be willing to, I think there's a better way of saying this, but to hold strong opinions but be willing to change your mind when presented with the appropriate data.
Absolutely. And as someone that has founded and grown 2 UX teams from scratch, what are the biggest lessons that you've learned along the way and that you'd possibly pass down to somebody listening at the beginning of their journey?
Yeah, definitely. I think the biggest lesson is that it's not all about your technical skills. That being a UX designer means that you need to be able to influence other people in the organization, and you have to have very, very good influence capabilities. And a lot of people actually don't really like that, because they want to be able to come into the work and use and open up their software called Sketch or whatever, and just pound out 8 hours of design work. But the way that you actually get good design implemented is by convincing the product management team, or convincing the engineering team, or whoever, whoever the business owners are, that your ideas are the right ideas. And that can be very, very difficult. Almost everybody in an organization is going to be passionate and have ideas about how they want things to go. And they're likely to have opinions about how the user experience or how the user interface should go. And even though you're the hired expert, you're not the only voice. So I would, any day now, if I have to choose to hire someone, if I could pick someone who had just like amazing technical skills, in other words, they were a great designer, but they were a very poor communicator, or they were, had a lot of ego, or really didn't want to interact with other people. If I had to pick between that and then someone who was, 75% as good, but had all these soft skills, there's absolutely no question I would take the person with the soft skills. So for anyone starting out, or even people in the middle of their career, they'll find that the way to grow is not just a technical path of becoming a better and better designer, which is important, of course, but is to also grow as a communicator and as someone who can be effective within an organization and talking to multiple different parties within the company.
And looking towards your own future, is there anything that particularly excites you about that road ahead for Strathearn Design?
Well, that's, my ultimate goal is to be able to kind of institute some of those soft skills that I was talking about. So I really would love to be able to work with different organizations, even ones who have really good technical skills, but are having trouble getting all their designers, to work well with others. Those are the challenges that I really relish. So basically giving advice on how to really properly build a UX practice. And it's not just about the technical skills, but about the people skills that are needed to be effective.
Well, you've got so much knowledge and experience, and your passion for the subject still shines through after all these years. So you must be doing something right. But for anyone listening that would just like to find out more information, how you can help, or just start a conversation with you, what's the best way of reaching out to you?
Yeah, I have, as you mentioned, my company is actually called Strathearn Design. In the US, this is actually a fairly standard name in Britain, but people struggle with it in the US. So my website actually is just sdesign.io. I'll just repeat that, sdesign.io. And if you go there, you'll find my email address. You'll find a form that you can contact me. There's also lots of articles, at least some articles I have up there, some of them specifically about the soft skills that I was talking about today. But that website gives a good, quick overview of kind of what I'm about.
Fantastic. Well, I'll add those links to the blog post that will accompany this episode, but I've thoroughly enjoyed talking with you today. So much value around the world of UX, and I love the fact that we're able to bust a few myths along the way. But more than anything, just a big thank you for taking the time to sit with me today, Sam.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Doesn't it feel good when you listen to someone who just knows what they're talking about, and just listening to them bust a few myths there, and hearing so much about what is UX, what isn't UX, and getting rid of some of those myths and annoyances that he may have gathered over the years. But also having the vision to see beyond those blurred lines between B2B and B2C, and hearing about the differences between B2B UX and B2C UX. I certainly hope you learned as much as I did today. But if you've got anything else that you would like to throw into the mix about today's conversation, my door is open to each and every one of you. Remember my email, you should know this off by heart by now, but I do give it at the end of every episode for good reason. I genuinely want to hear from you. So please email me, techblogwriter@outlook.com. All my social channels, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn is just @NeilCHughes. And my website is techblogwriter.co.uk, where you can find over 1,100 interviews with other tech leaders and similar stories, and hopefully learn a thing or two from those interviews too. However, we've reached the end of the line again, I'm afraid. Is the world spinning faster or something? It just seems that time just flies by these days. But you'll get another fix of the Tech Talks Daily podcast tomorrow, assuming you hit play, of course. No guarantees in life, as my son tells me. So a big thank you for listening. And until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thank you for listening to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast with Neil C. Hughes. Remember, technology works best when it brings people together.